On July 14, 1789, thousands of terrified Parisians smashed their way into the Bastille fortress. Rumors were swirling that the king's military was about to open fire on the city, and the people decided they'd rather fight than wait to be slaughtered. But a riot of this scale doesn't happen overnight. To understand how the streets of Paris reached a boiling point, we have to rewind to the moment a 20-year-old Louis XVI took the throne, inheriting a kingdom that was functionally bankrupt. The French treasury was empty, mostly because the crown had spent decades financing expensive foreign wars. They had recently poured massive resources into helping the 13 American colonies break away from Britain, driving the national debt up to 3 billion livres. With lenders demanding 10% interest, the government was drowning. At the exact same time, the royal family was living here. The Palace of Versailles was a sprawling, opulent estate that demanded massive amounts of money just to keep the lights on and the grounds manicured. You have a national treasury drained by war, and a monarchy burning through whatever cash is left to maintain their lavish lifestyle. The math simply didn't work. The state needed money immediately, which meant someone was going to have to pay new taxes. The problem was how French society was structured. The population was rigidly divided into 3 distinct social classes, called the 3 estates. This chart shows exactly how lopsided the system was. The first estate was the clergy, and the second estate was the nobility. These 2 groups made up a tiny fraction of the population, yet they owned 60% of the country's land. More importantly, they were entirely exempt from paying taxes. That left the third estate, the peasants, laborers, and middle-class merchants. The poorest people in the country were crushed under 100% of the national tax burden. They paid taxes to the church, to the state, and on everyday goods like salt. Then the weather turned. Between 1715 and 1789, the French population surged from 23 to 28 million people. But terrible harvests, severe droughts, and hailstorms destroyed the crops. This triggered what historians call a subsistence crisis, a situation where basic survival is threatened. Out on the streets, the cost of bread shot up so fast that ordinary workers, whose wages weren't moving at all, simply couldn't afford to eat. People were waiting in massive lines outside bakeries, desperate for any scrap of food. Squeeze the poorest citizens for every penny they have, and then take away their ability to feed their children. A society that hungry doesn't stay quiet for long. It becomes explosive. Desperate to manage the spiraling debt, King Louis XVI called a meeting of the Estates General. He needed their approval to raise taxes even higher. But as the scale visualizes, the Estates General was a rigged game. Every estate got exactly 1 collective vote. Because the tax-exempt clergy and nobility almost always agreed with each other, they could outvote the massive Third Estate by a margin of 2 to 1. The Third Estate realized they were walking into a trap, so they walked out. They gathered in an indoor tennis court, declared themselves the true National Assembly, and swore an oath not to leave until they had written a new constitution for France. With politicians defying him indoors and armed mobs ripping the Bastille apart outside, the king blinked. He accepted the National Assembly. Almost overnight, the ancient feudal system and special privileges of the nobility were legally erased. By 1791, the Assembly finished their new constitution. It stripped Louis XVI of his absolute power, chopping the government into distinct legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The king was reduced to a figurehead with a veto. But there was a catch. The right to vote wasn't given to everyone. You had to be a man over 25 who paid a specific amount in taxes. Everyone else, women, the poor, and the youth, were classified as passive citizens with 0 political voice. The wealthy middle class had stripped power from the royal family and handed it to themselves, but the starving laborers who had physically fought in the streets were left with nothing. This fragile new government shattered when it became clear the king wasn't playing along. Louis XVI was caught secretly writing to the rulers of Prussia and Austria, plotting to have foreign armies march in and crush the revolution. The National Assembly didn't wait. In 1792, they launched a preemptive war against Austria and Prussia. It was a massive gamble that drained the country's wealth and worsened food shortages. The angry, hungry citizens who couldn't vote needed an outlet and found it in political clubs. The most powerful of these were the Jacobins, a radical faction made up of shoemakers, laborers, and servants who felt the revolution had betrayed them. On August 10, 1792, the Jacobins and the armed masses stormed the royal palace. They killed the guards and took the king prisoner, forcing a massive change, the creation of a new republic where all men could vote. In January 1793, they placed Louis XVI on trial for treason, found him guilty, and executed him publicly. The republic had officially burned its bridges. There was no going back. Enter Maximilien Robespierre. As the leader of the Jacobins, he believed that the young republic was surrounded by enemies, and the only way to protect it was through absolute fear. He unleashed what became known as the Reign of Terror. If Robespierre suspected you of disloyalty, whether a nobleman, a rival, or a baker, you were arrested, tried, and executed by the guillotine. Robespierre micromanaged society to force total equality. He capped the price of bread, shut down the churches, and banned sir and madam. Everyone was simply a citizen. In their desperate rush to mandate equality and save their new nation, the radical leaders built a state machinery that was far more lethal and tyrannical than the absolute monarch they had just beheaded. But a government built on terror eventually eats its own. By July 1794, his own allies realized they might be next. They arrested Robespierre, and the very next day, he met the guillotine himself. With the radical faction decapitated, power snapped right back to the wealthy middle class. They drafted yet another constitution and handed control to a 5-member executive board called the Directory. The Directory immediately stripped voting rights away from the poor again. But this new setup was a disaster. The directors constantly fought with the legislative councils, paralyzing the government while the country struggled. That severe political instability created a massive power vacuum in Paris, and waiting in the wings was a highly successful, intensely ambitious military dictator named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon knew the French people were exhausted. By 1804, he took absolute control, crowning himself emperor. He brought order and modernized the laws, but entirely dismantled the democratic republic the people had fought for. Under his rule, the country took severe steps backward. One of his most brutal reversals was the reintroduction of slavery in the French Caribbean, completely destroying the abolition laws the Jacobins had passed a decade earlier. It is a bitter historical irony. After 10 years of starving, rioting, and executing thousands of people to rid themselves of an absolute monarch, the French nation willfully handed all of its power to a military dictator. Because the whole experiment collapsed back into an empire, does that mean the French Revolution failed? To answer that, we have to look at this document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It established a blueprint of human rights, freedom of speech, equality before the law, that directly challenged the old world order. Of course, the reality of those rights fell painfully short. Women were entirely locked out of the political process, despite leading many protests. It would take over 150 years of struggle before French women finally gained the right to vote in 1946. But despite excluding women and the colonized people of their empire, the core ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity could not be contained. They leaked out of France and infected the rest of the globe. The French Revolution proved that a society's rigid hierarchy isn't set in stone. When pushed to starvation, ordinary people proved they could dismantle an ancient regime by sheer force of will, forever planting the seeds for modern democracy.